Welcome to the third event, originally scheduled first, in our series of professional development workshops for the 2020 Leadership Alliance Summer Program. Thank you for making the rescheduled time. I'm Dr. Will Wittels. I'm the manager for undergraduate and graduate programs here at the Leadership Alliance. I will be the moderator for today's event. This event is a component of the Leadership Alliance Virtual Professional Development Program. Leadership Alliance partners created this initiative to ensure continuity of skill building, networking, and exposure to graduate programs for students from across the country. Paired with our Monday evening Conversation with the Doctoral Scholar series, we hope to provide you with a platform for discussion of critical issues, networking with each other and our wonderful doctoral scholars, as well as for learning approaches and skills for navigating your research careers. This series would not be possible without the work of my colleagues at Brown University, Chaminade University in Honolulu, Weill Cornell Medical College, and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. To those colleagues, thank you for your efforts in creating this program. Today, we will be talking about research in the era of COVID-19. Certainly, the pandemic has changed the way we all do research. It has also changed how we think about research and how we must make decisions about research. We are joined by three stellar scholars who will be sharing their perspectives and excellent insights on those issues. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. Dr. Tracy Delgado was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. She attended UCLA for undergrad, where she developed a huge passion for science and UCLA football. While at UCLA, she did molecular biology, cancer biology, and herpes virus research. After receiving her BS in microbiology, immunology, and molecular genetics from UCLA, she moved to Seattle to pursue a PhD degree in microbiology at the University of Washington. After graduation, Dr. Delgado spent 8 years as a biology professor at Northwest University before joining the biology faculty at Seattle Pacific University in 2019. As an educator, Dr. Delgado strives to encourage academic excellence from both her students and herself. She finds teaching to be very rewarding because it allows her to train, motivate, and shape the lives of her students by instilling knowledge they can use for a lifetime. She is very committed to providing a learning environment that is both exciting, interactive, and rigorous. Dr. Delgado teaches courses in cell biology and general biology. It is estimated that 15 to 20% of cancers worldwide are caused by virus infections. Dr. Delgado's research focuses on how understanding herpes viruses cause cancer by altering the host cell metabolism. Her lab is also working to identify metabolic inhibitors that can provide new antiviral treatments. In 2015, Dr. Delgado gave a TEDx talk, which highlights her research entitled The Future of Antiviral Therapy. We'll be sure to post that in the development classroom. All the experiments in her labs are performed by undergraduate students, and many of her students have won awards for their research both at national and regional conferences. One of Dr. Delgado's passions is to help increase the number of underrepresented minorities in science. Since 2004, Dr. Delgado has been a member of the National Society of Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in the Sciences, SACNAS. She has been involved with SACNAS both regionally and nationally, organized over 30 outreach events in the greater Seattle area, given talks and led discussions at the national conference, and provides mentorship to many students. Dr. Delgado was a speaker at the Seattle March for Science in 2017, where she discussed the need for more underrepresented minorities in science. Omar Galarraga, and I apologize for not being able to roll my R's, Dr. Omar Galarraga is a health economist and an associate professor of health services policy and practice at the Brown University School of Public Health, where he's worked since 2010. He holds joint appointments at Brown University's Population Studies and Training Center, the Center for Gerontology and Healthcare Research, and the International Health Institute. He is also an affiliate of the Health Econometrics and Data Group at York University in the UK. Prior to Brown, he was a researcher at the Institute of Business and Economics Research at the University of California at Berkeley and at the Health Economics Division of the Mexican National Institute of Public Health, where he conducted research and taught for 4 years. He has also been a visiting professor at Boston University, Northeastern University, and the Center for Population and Development Studies at Harvard University. Prior to his academic career, he worked at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Ethiopia, as well as Mathematica Policy Research, Inc., John Snow, Inc., and Helen Keller International, and has consulted for several international organizations, including the World Bank, UNAIDS, the World Health Organization, and the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. He served as associate editor for BMC Health Services Research and currently serves as Health and Economics Associate Editor for the Journal of the International AIDS Society, where he's been a member of the editorial board since 2015. Dr. Mark Hernandez is the S.J. Archuleta Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering. He directs the Environmental Engineering Microbiology and Disinfection Lab at the University of Colorado. This lab focuses on the characterization and control of microbiological air pollution and microbially induced corrosion. The lab develops genetic, biochemical, and toxicological techniques to assess the efficiency of engineering interventions in the sectors of sanitary engineering and industrial hygiene that are relevant to environmental health. There is a special focus on aerobiology science for wide area surveillance, indoor cleaning technology, and the design of aerosol disinfection systems built for the environment. I could go on with Dr. Hernandez's bio, but he has asked that we only introduce that first paragraph. Welcome to all three of you. We're really thrilled that you're here. We're really thrilled that you were able to make the rescheduled time. I'm looking forward to a really excellent discussion, and I know our students are as well. My first question is, and why don't we start with you, Tracy, and then go to you, Dr. Delgado, excuse me, and then go to Dr. Galarraga, and then go to Dr. Hernandez. Start with question number one, which is, the economist James Tobin once said, the most important decisions a scholar makes are what problems to work on. How do you decide what problems to work on?
So as I started journeying as a scientist, I think one of the problems, as you think about problems to work on, I think one of them is usually it's things that hit home or your society, or you see people suffering with, more particularly with me in disease. I think cancer is rampant. There's a lot of people dying of cancer. You know, people maybe in your families, people that maybe in your community, you see health disparities. And so cancer was something that really I was starting, as an undergrad, I started to get really passionate about understanding what causes cancer. And so as I really dove into cancer, I realized that there was another big problem that needed to be solved, which was viruses and virus infections, and specifically the ones that cause cancer. And so, I mean, I think it's part of it is what's your passion. You know, everybody has different passions and things that interest them. But I also, for me personally, I was looking at diseases such as viruses or viruses that cause cancer, and either lack of education, of understanding how they work. Most people didn't realize that about 15% of cancers are caused by viruses. And so as I was searching what problems to work with, I really was focusing on, I think, problems that not a lot of people are always aware of with viruses and cancer, and something that fascinated me with viruses not being alive, but at the same time can cause cancer. What's the mechanism, and how do we save lives? And so that was kind of my experience of really getting into cancer research, having some virus experience, and then realizing you could do both, and this is a very significant problem. And even things like, as I mentioned before, just having education, things like HPV, human papillomavirus causing cancer, cervical cancer, and vaccinations. For that, having kind of not just the science behind that and understanding how cancer happens through this virus, but also public education to realize, hey, there is a vaccine and it can save your life. So really giving, I guess you would say, more public service announcements and talking to people who are not scientists, like your family and your community, and really, talking about how this virus can cause cancer and how there is treatments, or in this case, a vaccine to help combat that. And so, I mean, there's different ways people will make decisions on what to work with. For me, it was very much seeing we have a problem with cancer, we have a problem with viruses, and really I can just focus on viruses or just focus on cancer or both at the same time. And I felt like I can contribute a lot to society with knowledge, not just scientifically in my lab, but also with knowledge of disseminating information to the public where they can make informed decisions, which, especially coming from a Latino community, you know, you don't have a lot of people out there that are really able to kind of explain the science so that they can make well-informed choices.
Thanks, Dr. Delgado. Dr. Galarraga, please.
Sure. Thanks, Will, for introducing me. I'm fine if you just call me Omar too, if it's easier. And yes, and those of you out there who can roll your R's, I am Omar Galarraga, and that's fine. And if you can, it's okay, Galarraga. And I'm very happy here at Brown University School of Public Health since 2010. And I'm trained as a health economist, as you heard. But it's interesting this year, 2020, so it's been 10 years at Brown, and it's about 20 years since I started studying HIV. So I became interested in HIV in the late 90s while working for the UN in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa. And momentarily, I'll show you some data from there that we will share with you. But at the time, I was just doing research for the UN, and I started, you know, looking that young people within the UN complex and outside were, you know, very thin, and they had what some of them call wasting disease. Some of them just refer to some cancer. They say, oh yeah, he's got cancer of the brain. But it became very clear that many of them had HIV. And there was no treatment available at that time in Ethiopia because it was very expensive. So in the late 90s, so highly active antiretroviral treatment became widely available in the United States and approved by the FDA, I think in April 1996. So late 1990s, you did not have antiretroviral treatment for HIV in most of Africa because it was too expensive. We're talking, you know, $15,000 to $20,000 per person per year. And at that time, I remember looking at the statistics, and we had a budget of about 50 cents per person per year for HIV treatment and prevention in Ethiopia. What can you buy with that? Maybe a couple of condoms, no more than that. So as a health economist, I quickly became hyper aware that there was an issue of equity, and people were dying on the streets, literally dying on the streets because they couldn't afford the treatment. If you were in the US and, you know, you had any health insurance, you had treatment and your life was saved. Your life was spared if you were, you know, European or American, but if you were African, you were dying. And that gave me impetus to continue studying, and you know, then I focused on basically doctoral studies on HIV and economics, which I was very fortunate to land at Hopkins, at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where we had access to a lot of data. And so focusing on what I started to focus 20 years ago was, I became passionate about the issue of HIV and access to treatment and the links with poverty and inequality and health disparities. And then it was just a matter of thinking, well, what data sets can I use? What was available to me at Hopkins, which was a lot. And I ended up working with sort of the largest cohorts for HIV positive people in the US, the WISE and MAX cohort, Women's Interagency HIV study, and the men's AIDS cohort study. At that time, there was not a whole lot in sub-Saharan Africa data, micro data in the sub-Saharan Africa that I could use. There's more now, but not at that time. So that's how I chose. And so it's a combination of things. As Tracy mentioned, you know, what you're passionate about, what puts fire in your belly, but also, you know, what's available to you, what's your training, what motivates you, what's your institution like, and your advisors. So you have to think strategically about these things. And we'll talk more about whether to make a decision, you know, on COVID and how you make that decision. But certainly it shouldn't be something that you take lightly. I think you have to think about it very carefully. And we'll talk more about some of the parameters that may go into that decision.
Dr. Hernandez.
There we go. Okay. I'm going to borrow a little bit both from Omar and Tracy. I'm an engineer. I'm not a medical professional, or I have some microbiological training, but really I'm an engineer. And both Tracy and Omar mentioned training and passion. Yeah. And I think why I chose to go into engineering, civil engineering in particular, it doesn't sound, it's not a sexy medical career, but we're the people who are chartered with making sure when you open the tap in your kitchen or in your bathroom, you have clean water, that water quality is good and you can drink it and not worry about getting sick. And when I was a young man, neither of my grandparents had that in their houses. They didn't have water tapped. One set of grandparents were on El Paso, Texas, near the border with Mexico. The other set were on a Depression era farm in the Midwest, and they didn't have any running water. But my peers did. So I became very interested in this as a young man and chose to study how do we get clean water to people and make sure that you don't get sick from that. That has now progressed into air. We don't have any choice about drinking water and air. We have to breathe, we have to drink, and that stuff has to be free of microorganisms that can make us sick. So unlike a doctor or a health researcher, engineers protect a large population. We do things, we learn to design systems that will make sure when the air is moving through the building, it doesn't have chemicals or microbes in it, or when you open the tap or you bathe in it, and millions of gallons a day of water for a city, have to be produced. So that's what drove me, I think, is my childhood experience with my grandparents who didn't have this luxury. Still, you'd be surprised the number of homes in the United States that don't have that yet. So you touched on all this. Once I got my training, then I became very interested in things we can't control, right? I can go buy a bottle of water for $1. I don't have the same control over the air we breathe. And we see that now in the COVID pandemic, right? We have to wear a mask because the air in buildings is not free of pathogens. So interest as a young person drove me because I saw what my family didn't have, to study that and to help populations that don't have clean water. Once I had my training, I became interested in other challenges to public health at large that an engineer can deal with. And that is cities at large having both clean water and getting rid of sewage, as well as the microbes in the air we breathe. So that combination of factors led me to my career now, which is an unfortunate reality of society. Yeah. I mean, having to disinfect water and having to disinfect air is not a nice position. It's a great challenge, but engineers are uniquely poised to deal with that. So I teach people how to design ventilation systems for buildings to minimize COVID spread or disinfect air, just like we do for water at the tap. So I'm driven by challenges in society that end up in the medical sphere, like Tracy and Omar described, but I'm more on source control and characterizing these things on very large scales. So that's what drives me.
Stay unmuted because we're going to move to the next question, and you're up first. We'll go in reverse order. The next question is, COVID-19 feels like an all hands on deck moment now more than ever, and especially so with regards to disparities in health outcomes. Have you pivoted your research towards this and related outcomes? And if so, how have you done that?
This one's for me in particular, or any of us?
We'll go in reverse order from the last question.
Okay. I mean, the things that we've talked about, some of the three things that we've just talked about, AIDS, cancer, COVID, these are equal opportunity diseases, right? We all get sick from them in more than we would like, right? They affect broad swaths of the population. how healthy we are when we encounter those, the density at which we do so. Are different communities affected differently? Yeah, absolutely. But the fundamental part of it, I think each of us are studying, right? How is that common between all of us? How we get sick from viruses, how we get cancer from viruses, how we get sick when we inhale this stuff. We're all human. So what I love about science is this is a great uniter. Yeah. And I enjoy studying and training all of us. Do we have all access to the same science and the same vitamins and the same food and the same medicines like Omar brought up? No, we don't. But studying the fundamental basis for it brings us together, and training people from underrepresented backgrounds that are subject to these disparities. That is my passion. Absolutely. You know, coming from a home that had no drinking water to an engineer that actually treats it, I couldn't have a more rewarding career. So I think, and I heard a piece from each of you that, you know, studying this is a great uniter to help with these disparities. So I'll stop there.
So if we're going in reverse order, it's my turn, Will? So how about if we share those slides, if you don't mind, so that we get some visual break for the. So I prepare these. They're very brief and they have just questions. But in the next one, I always try to bring some levity. And so this came out yesterday in my New York cartoon feed. So as you can see, I think it's God there and just saying, this kid is asking him, or this angel, I'm not sure, asking him, I thought the end of the world was scheduled for 2012. Obviously not for 2020, right? Here we're thinking that we're in the middle of the end of the world. You know, at the risk of sounding old, this too shall pass. I know that that's something that the grandmas used to say, but the grandmas were very smart. And so in the next slide, there is something that I've been looking at every year for the last 20 years. So if you've watched the movie and the band played on, or if you read the book, in there, the young epidemiologist that worked on the CDC and started investigating HIV in the early 80s, he used to call it the butcher's bill, apparently from some Napoleonic War reference. So this to me was also the butcher's bill. Every year you would get another one of these. And if you look at it, the number that I want you to look at is the 770,000 people that died from AIDS-related illnesses at the end of 2018, right? This number, thank goodness, has been coming down because we now have antiretroviral treatment. But if you look at the bottom number, 32 million people have died of AIDS-related illnesses since the start of the epidemic. So in the 20 years that I've been looking at this disease, probably, you know, most of these deaths have happened in the last 20 years, probably, I don't know, 20 million at least. So I don't know if you're probably looking at the COVID deaths every day if you are obsessed like I am, right? So I have the JH2 coronavirus map in front of me almost all the time. And global deaths as of 2 minutes ago was 507,188, which is obviously way too many deaths. Awful, probably the worst we've seen in our lifetimes for a single disease so quickly. But what I wanted to bring to your attention is that this is still a fraction of the AIDS deaths. And if you move to the next slide, this is even a smaller fraction of the TB deaths, tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is still the largest killer in the world. Most of the deaths happen in sub-Saharan Africa. And look at the graph on your right. Between 2000 and 2015, the last 15, 20 years, we've gone on a clip of over 1.5 million deaths per year. So this just to put the COVID deaths in perspective. Of course, one death is one death too many. Please don't misunderstand me. All I'm saying is that we have very many terrible diseases like HIV and TB, and many of us don't pay attention. Why? Because they just happen to be in sub-Saharan Africa. And so we don't care. Now, because they're happening in the cities we live in, because they're happening in New York, in LA, in Seattle, now we care because now we know somebody that was affected or we know somebody that died. And of course, now we care more, and it is terrible, and we're going through a terrible time. All I'm saying is that we have to put this into perspective. And we always will have challenges like this as humans, and we have to raise up to the challenge, bring science and bring the best of our creativity to tackle these issues. And so this brings me a long way of going to answer the question, which is in the next slide. How I became interested. Sorry, the next one. How I became interested and whether to study this or something else. This is what I was just telling you about. Data on HIV in Ethiopia, and if you can see there, the late 90s, it was very, very high for Addis Ababa, which is where I was. You can see is the top curve. I think it's sort of what color is that? Sort of pink. And so I was very much seeing it on the streets because it was so high. The prevalence of what is this, about 14%. So 14 out of every 100 people were HIV positive. So obviously you start to see it on the streets. And in some other African cities, it was even higher. So many things will determine, what you study, and many of it is the historical context. So for many of us, COVID may be a watershed moment that you decide to embark on it. But for many, it may not, because there may be other opportunities, quote unquote, right? We always will have challenges, and we just have to be well trained and trust in science that we can tackle any challenge, and then trust in various sciences, right? Because then we have to come up with a vaccine, or we have to come up with treatment, but then we have to think of implementation science. How will we roll out this to millions of people, not only in the US and Europe, but also in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Asia. I should stop. I could continue, but I should stop and let Tracy talk, and then I'll come back.
And that was kind of early on in my project of discovering these changes in cell metabolism. But as time went on, I realized that cancer-causing viruses are not the only viruses that alter metabolism. And more papers came out from HIV to influenza virus to other viruses that are not herpes viruses, even West Nile virus, other viruses that affect other parts of this world, that they are also manipulating the host cell metabolism. So while my research has always been focused on looking at cancer-causing viruses, it was always in my head that I wish I can test and see if this is happening in all the viruses and try therapeutics that may work for cancer-causing viruses and use those same metabolism inhibitors to be more broad. And that's where my TED Talk came in a couple years ago, where I basically was saying, well, if viruses in general are altering metabolism, not just cancer-causing viruses, even though that's my focus, this research is more broad, because I was able to show through published studies that if you inhibit certain parts of metabolism, then you can end up blocking virus replication. And a lot of people would say, well, let's just say you inhibit fat metabolism, you can't do that forever because you would lose weight and die, right? Not good. If you did it long term. But I would always come back and say, well, this treatment may not be a long-term solution, but should say a pandemic virus come out, and that pandemic virus, we have no treatment, and there's a universal treatments of metabolism inhibitors that may work broadly against viruses for a short period of time, but while your body fights back for 2-3 weeks, you can give them these drugs, and maybe this will help them through that process. And then once your body fights it back, you can take them off the drugs. So that was my hope, big dream, and still is to try and find FDA approved drugs that are already clinically relevant. That's kind of what I was hoping to do this summer, but everything got shut down because I have an undergraduate lab and I can't do any research right now. I'm still waiting like any day now, like, will I be able to, you know, they're still figuring things out for my campus. But that's kind of what my research has always been on, like fighting viruses and fighting one specifically against cancer, because that was my passion. But I've always had it to think about this more broadly, more than just what I was thinking, because viruses can act in similar mechanisms. And so if I could, I would work on COVID-19 and try my drugs that I have in my lab and try it against COVID, but I don't have a BSL-3, which is levels, there's 4 levels for viruses. Like level 1 is like, it's not really gonna hurt you. Level 2 can cause disease, which is what I have. Level 3 is like really bad disease, like higher containment, like HIV. And then there's level 4, which is like you need the spacesuits and things like that. And that's like in the CDC and specific facilities. COVID-19 is classified biosafety level 3. So I do not have the lab facility to test COVID-19, but I have the lab facility to test other coronaviruses, which is what I hope to do in the future now that I've seen how this has gone, and say I could test level 2, which are not as pathogenic or not as disease causing deaths, you know, like your typical, where there's 4 coronaviruses that are constantly circulating that give you common colds, but they're not severe. So that's kind of my hope, is to test. This has kind of shifted my thought and said, well, my lab is not open at this moment. As soon as I can, I would like to take some coronaviruses and test my specific drugs that I'm looking at and see if they work broadly against coronaviruses as well. And I think the main thing is, like, a lot of scientists is usually competitive, you know, like I want to be there first and everything. And like right now I've seen science change. I've seen science, people are just trying to help and do the best they can to stop it. We see companies, you know, getting together with basic, you know, R01 or whatever research institutions. It's really all hands on deck. There's like over 100 different vaccines in trials right now. There's so much going on. And I think being able to contribute what you can, for me physically, I can't do it right now, which makes me anxious, but I really can't wait to get back in the lab and try it. But I think in general, it's like, do what you can, you know, at the moment. So right now I'm just doing a lot of reading and a lot of doing public kind of announcements and discussions on how COVID-19 works. And I could talk about that in question 3. But that's kind of where I'm at right now, is just, you know, doing the best I can, preparing myself mentally, like how can I shift my research to get a little bit more broad in the meantime, once my lab opens back up again.
I'm going to reverse the order, so feel free to start on question 3, which is, what would be your advice to researchers seeking to pivot towards COVID-19? And what would be your advice to researchers who do not feel that they can?
Yeah, I mean, so it depends on, like we talked about, you have training, and your training can help you, you know, if you have some sort of virus background or something that you can like maybe physically do things to help with sanitation or help with actually, you know, experimenting with viruses. That, you know, for me, I could do that because I'm a virologist with actual experiments with viruses in my lab. But I want to comment more on for people who feel they have nothing they can really contribute. And I think that's totally false in a way that I think it's like people don't realize that you're scientifically trained to read scientific papers. You're trained to digest methods and understand those methods. And because of that, you're more equipped to answer questions to the public when they have them. So as my lab shut down, I was like, what do I do? And I basically went on Facebook and I said, hey, who has questions about coronaviruses and what kind of questions do you have? And I was like flooded with people, you know, asking questions. Like almost every day I get people thanking me for the information I gave them, because I would type up things in a way that the general audience can understand. Non-scientists, your family, your friends, you have knowledge as a scientist, you have knowledge that they do not have. And this is a way you can contribute back to your community and to your family, is helping them understand, and also helping them weed away from kind of pseudoscience and other things that the media is just popping everything. Is really hard. I find a lot of people saying it's really hard to discern what's true and what's not. And so you being a scientist and being trained as a scientist, you have the ability to look at papers or articles and say, this is what the paper is saying. This is not what the paper is saying, but the media is hyping. Or, you know, scare tactics, or CO2, breathing in CO2 from your mask, which is totally false. And so there's like tons of, you know, claims out there, and you as a scientist are equipped to give public information to your friends, your family, your community, your whatever social media pages, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever you use. You have the ability, and be empowered in that. You have the ability as a scientist, because of your training, to tell other people how to interpret the data to make good life decisions on how they, you know, interact with the world around them or not, right? Stay home. But in general, when they do go out, like, how do you stay safe so that people in our community stay safe and don't contract this virus?
So in the next one, I started to answer this question. So the next one is starting to summarize some of the issues that I mentioned already, right? So my personal pivot points were my first job. After I finished my master's in health economics, my first job was in micronutrients, and it was economic analysis of micronutrients. I did not know what macronutrients were. I was trained to do cost effectiveness, so I knew how to, you know, crunch numbers, and I knew how to do costs and benefits, but I did not know what macronutrients were. I had to go to the library and learn. Oh, it's vitamin A, iron, iodine. Oh, that's great. And they were very important. And back then it was like 1.2 billion people around the world don't get enough micronutrients. So they don't get enough vitamin A, so they cannot see well, and they cannot develop well, and some of them die. And so I became very passionate about this issue of micronutrient interventions. And as I mentioned to you, once I was in Ethiopia later working for the UN, I became interested in HIV/AIDS. Once I went to Mexico to work for the Mexican School of Public Health after I got my PhD, they were sitting on a trove of data for Oportunidades Progresa, the conditional cash transfer program, and also for Seguro Popular, which is the popular health insurance, so insurance for the poor. So I became interested in these issues because data was there. And in the last, 10, 15 years, many things have come through. So I remember too in 9/11, you know, this was 2001, of course, September 11, 2001. I was in class, and I remember, you know, as the attack on the Twin Towers happened, I remember talking to my classmates and saying, a couple of my classmates saying, you know, this is a watershed moment. And I remember a couple of classmates later on saying, let's write something about this, because we are studying economics and psychology, behavioral economics, which is another thing that I do. But I decided not to do it, and because I didn't feel like I was ready. And when SARS came, I didn't do anything. And when H1N1 came, and I was in Mexico, and Mexico was shut down, and some of my colleagues were in charge of the shutting down, former colleagues from school were in charge, I still didn't think that I was ready or should pivot because of various circumstances, or similarly with MERS and Ebola. But now in 2020, as COVID-19 hit, I don't know, perhaps it's because I recently got tenure, or because after 20 years on HIV, I decided that I needed something new, or because this really hit me differently, right? It was hitting me personally. I've been, as many of you, as most of you have, you know, been stuck at home for the last 3-4 months. So I had a lot of time to think and say, well, maybe I should do something. Like Tracy said, you know, I have the tools. I can do this. I've been doing HIV for 20 years. Pivoting to COVID is not hard. And so I am working on COVID, and here in the US, I'm looking at health insurance claims for COVID and how they're changing here in the state of Rhode Island. And we just had something accepted to present at the American Economics Association meetings that are going to happen in early January in Chicago, or most likely online, on inequality as a function of infectious diseases, including COVID, for the last 20 years. So explaining changes in inequality through something called, of course, the Gini coefficient, which is how we measure inequality, income inequality. And also another project that I've involved is in explaining COVID deaths and COVID cases as a function of poverty, inequality, trust in government, democracy, these things that I earlier on discovered that are also important when you explain access to health and prevention. And so it's used oftentimes linked to the Human Development Index. It's not just money, but it's many things that go along with development process. So all of these things are sort of now very interesting and active research agenda for me. I'm also developing methods to measure how social distancing and mitigation, public health mitigation affects psychosocial, economic indicators at the individual level. So I'm measuring those effects as well. So I personally decided that yes, COVID was the time, and I'll stop in the next one if you don't mind, Will, just very quickly to summarize all of these. There are many issues to consider, and we've gone this. So this is just a review. What's your background, your training? Do you have the time, the patience? Do you have the enthusiasm? Does it put fire in your belly? If it doesn't, leave it. You're gonna have to have a lot of stamina. Do you have the experience, the relevant experience? And if you can answer yes to most of these things, or definitely yes and a resounding yes, then how should you proceed? And I think what you heard is this generalizability problem, which I call theory, right? Which is sort of the knowledge, that accumulated knowledge. Don't be guided on intuition and gut feeling. That usually can be problematic, right? You have to build on science, and then be a little flexible and creative and expand your toolbox. But always remember, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. One of the questions already were, a lot of people are doing things in a hurry. No, don't cut corners. Do it right. Do it once, do it right. Being the first is usually not the best. You may win something quickly, but to really make a difference, you want to do solid science that withstand the test of time.
I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. I think, the common theme of us is we started with training that was interesting to us. We followed that training to advanced training, graduate school, that gave us very elite skills to address things that plague a lot of people. And we enjoy that work. The training to be able to help people is a blessing, no matter if it be medical, economics, microbiology, or engineering. And I think Omar made a very good point, is if you're not really excited about it, probably not a path to follow, because the reality of graduate training or any technical training is it's hard and you have to be dedicated to it. And the reality of the problems that we face, they're ugly. COVID, cancer, AIDS, viruses, these are ugly, dangerous things that we have to deal with. And they're long-term solutions. We don't solve them tomorrow, and you have to be into this for the long run. As I age, I see that becoming more and more important and more frustrating, that I don't see solutions. Omar, you said, these are 20 years of millions of deaths. Tracy said, the density of cancer is increasing, not decreasing. I mean, we are addressing human suffering, but it's slow, and it takes a lot of patience and dedication. So no matter what you do, be patient and dedicated to it. Maybe cancer isn't your love, or engineering, or herpes, or whatever, but find your love, dedicate yourself to what interests you for your own good and the good of the society. And that will drive you and keep you in it. And that's what has kept me interested every day. The headlines are unfortunate, but they are not going to change. When COVID's over, it's going to be something else that we're going to have to figure out. But we haven't figured out the very things we're talking about yet. And they need young people to become interested, dedicated, and take the next generation of work. So I'll leave it there.
So I'm going to move to questions that we received from the students before the panel. This is the question, given the current situation of COVID-19, how do you manage to overcome the physical obstacles, such as social distancing, being unable to go to your research facilities, in order to continue your research? And what advice do you have for researchers who are facing negative outcomes related to that?
My lab did not shut down. I'm actually working with coronavirus in the lab. So first of all, Tracy, I want to offer you a surrogate. I can send you murine coronavirus. It's BSL-2. It's a model that you can use. It's very closely related to COVID without going to BSL-3. So, but I think it sounds like both of you, well, Tracy in particular, you're poised to answer this question. So I'll mute.
Can you repeat the question? I think I heard part of it.
Sure thing. Given the current situation of COVID-19, how did you manage to overcome the physical obstacles, such as social distancing, research facilities closing due to the pandemic, etc., in order to continue your research? Also, what advice would you give to researchers currently facing negative outcomes on their research because of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough all around. I mean, there are some people who are working 24 hours a day with COVID-19, don't have any breaks, and people who are able to stay at home and they're not able to go to their lab. And so I think for me personally, I mean, I was also in the middle of the academic year. So I teach cell biology in the spring. So I was teaching cell biology and I was doing, I had to drop my lab and my students, and it was really devastating. We couldn't do any type of research at the time. And I really just kind of shifted some of my classes just to really focus. I had a scientific journal club that I was teaching, and I shifted everything to COVID so we can keep up with reading and have student discussions and education. And so really my focus has just been education, educating my students, educating the public, educating, I'm on committees to help discern information, just how you use disinfectants in businesses and churches and other types of facilities, just to make sure that people are staying safe. And so for the people whose research is on hold, I mean, it's rough because, you may be in the middle of your PhD or trying to graduate. I had I feel so sad. I had a senior student who just was starting to collect data and then it stopped and he graduated and he could never get that time back. He's never going to be able to finish that. But I think what's important is to realize, whatever you have contributed so far to science, whether you have the opportunity to finish or not, science will move on. What I really want to focus on is, can we save lives? That's me. It is just knowing the bigger picture of things. It's yeah, I wish I could do all these things, but in the end, what can I do personally to save lives? Whether it be disseminating information or whether it be physically working with the virus. My passions have to be put on hold with cancer right now, and I could read literature and catch up that way and plan. But in the meantime, I'm just focusing on making sure that people around me know what to do so that they can keep their lives safe.
Shall I move on to the next question? So this question actually comes from one of our coordinators. How do you align health messaging to effectively break through, in some cases, obstacles of cultural norms? To further break down the term cultural norms, I mean values emerging from, but also those moving beyond quote unquote ethnic cultures to include political points of view or individual family belief systems. Omar, I'll volunteer you.
Yes, we really need a public health anthropologist, but I can, since we don't have one here, I'll do my best from an economics lens. I think, or from a public health economics lens, I think that what I repeat always in public health, I studied at the School of Public Health and I work now at the School of Public Health. We all have to remember who the enemy is. The enemy is the virus. And so it's all hands on deck against the enemy. And I don't care what your training is, right? We have to work together. I'm a health economist, but I work with anthropologists, I work with sociologists, and I work with epidemiologists and doctors and nurses, and I work with community health workers. I work with anybody who wants to work against HIV. And I saw the little I've seen in terms of health communication, then I think it needs to be that way as well, right? It's not, left or right or political conservative versus liberal. It's you're either against the disease or for the disease, right? So, and just take a public health science view and you know, we've developed this science for a long time, so it should not be about politics. It should be about public health science. And one of the questions, which is a related question, you know, can it be prevented? Could have been prevented? And yes, it can be prevented. I mean, you have public health measures that have been put in place in countries like Taiwan, many parts in North Korea, or, you know, the whole island of New Zealand, where I think last time I checked, Taiwan had, I think, 7 deaths in a country of 23 million people because they had a vice president who's an epidemiologist, a woman the president's a woman, as in New Zealand, that were very quick to assemble a group of experts and listen to the group of experts and did what they should do, which is, you know, contact tracing and trying to suppress the virus, not just mitigation. And they were very well prepared with everything that was needed. So yes, it can be prevented if you put in place public health science.
Mark or Tracy?
I mean, yeah, that's a big question. And we have, you know, a huge population in this country, over 300 million. We have, you know, generational divides, cultures from all over the world, particularly in our big cities, you know, that they have critical mass, and they're, you know, communicating, you know, that was the bundle of things that you said. You know, it was cultural, political awareness. It had all the elements. And, you know, I have a tough time at my university convincing my administrators to just put up bilingual web pages. We're talking about communicating sensitive medical information to different members of our society in the context of their political and cultural lenses and ages. And that, for this country, is just such a huge challenge. I don't know how to say it, but what I do know is that enough of us are trained that we can go to our families or cultural centers in my community, you know, it centers around a church, and we can help, we can be sensitive to the populations we do understand and the languages we do speak and the elders that we are in contact with, and you know, at least affect our world in the cultural lens and the political environment that we're acute with our science training, and people trust and believe us. So do I bring groceries to the elder people in the church, or get younger people to do that for them with masks and so on, so they don't get exposed? Absolutely. And do I pick the Spanish speaking students to do that? Absolutely. But I wouldn't know how to do that in a Cambodian population or another Pacific Islander or a Native American community. I mean, we all have to affect what we're the experts in and reach our communities with the knowledge we have. But that, in this big country, there isn't one, and there's not going to be one size fit all, except for education. That's the enabler to get the trust of our community. Once we're there, then we can help ours with our respective backgrounds and experience. So, and this is not going to get, I don't know that that's going to get better in such a diverse society, but if we work together, it can get better. That's for sure, with science being the great equalizer.
This dovetails with another question that came in. This is from Lasser Nee Coughlin, who's a rising senior at Penn State, majoring in biology. Their question is, have you ever struggled to communicate your research and the significance of your research to the public or your peers? How did you overcome this difficulty?
Anybody want to tackle that?
I think we'll kick it back to you.
I struggle up to the point of peer review. So all of us present blindly our results or what we think are significant results to a publication forum, to a publisher. And we have peers blindly review us. And if it makes a certain standard, it's published. After that, I don't struggle with it. And I'm going to put this out there. I don't do social media because that's not peer reviewed. It is not, at least I don't do it for science. And I saw some dialogue about that in the question and answer session. What do you do about, opinions on social media? And my answer is I don't, because I don't use it for opinion. I use it for only appointments and announcements or direction, but I don't cast opinion and I don't receive opinion there. It's a functional, it's a lens to see, hey, what my lab does. The hashtag aerobiology lab at CU. You can see what happens in that lab. But if you want to have an opinion about it, we won't receive it there, and I won't make an opinion on social media there. My personal choice as a scientist is that's an information portal, and where I do my communication is strictly through peer review, letters to the editor, and so on. So that's how I've chosen to do business, for better or for worse.
So how about Tracy? Then we'll give Omar the last word because we're running out of time.
So this was disseminating information again?
Yeah, and if you've had trouble explaining your research as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of practice. It's especially teaching, I teach everything from non-majors biology to upper division cell biology, so it's a big range of being able to talk at this level to scientists or even at like conferences and stuff like that. And then you're talking to non-majors or your mom. Like I think about like, how would I explain this to my mom? And my mom didn't graduate from high school. My grandmother didn't graduate from 3rd grade. And so being able to explain this in a way that they understand took a lot of practice. And I think the practice was my childhood and beyond. Through college, every day I would talk to them and they asked me questions. So I think it's something that the more you do it, the more, it works. For me, I do use social media a lot. I find it's a good tool for me to disseminate information. There is sometimes banter, and I don't really entertain the banter. What I use it really is to give facts. So I will look at the papers, put links, and say, this is what the paper says in a general audience version so that you understand it, because I'm a scientist, I could read it deeper and understand it deeper. So I break it down in a way that a general person can understand. So I guess it's kind of like science writing, but it's kind of different, but it's really in a way that I can say. People are saying, I see this and I see that. So I'm not really entertaining that. I'm more just saying, you guys have these questions. Here's a link to the science paper and here's a little blurb of what that means. Here's a link to the science paper. This is a little blurb in a way that you understood. And I felt like many people have like just waiting for the next post. And it's not like because it's a celebrity thing or anything like that. It's literally me just trying to give information that's helpful so that when they're going out, everything from how to make a proper disinfectant and why that works that way. Why does soap dissolve a virus? So it's really just kind of disseminating knowledge that we take for granted. And if there's people who don't agree, it's fine. If they don't want to believe in science, that's fine. Like, I'm just going to tell you what science says, and which for me is like, this is science, this is fact. Like, it's not an opinion. I'm not, this is what it is, and this is what it shows. And has science changed through time, through COVID? Yes. Like at first it was no mask, and then it was mask because scientific studies showed that it was effective at preventing droplet spread to other people. And so I think in some ways it's been an interesting kind of journey to see, how science has evolved in COVID-19 research in just a short period of time, and how much more we know, and how much more will we know in 6 months from now, and things like that. So that's really my passion, is to tell people what I know as a scientist and give them those facts in a way that they can understand.
So I'm somewhere in between. I do use Twitter now. Every time there's a new paper, I tweet about the paper with the link. So I'm somewhere in between Mark and Tracy. But if you allow me 1 minute, Will, to answer another question, which was related to H1N1 experience in Mexico. which is related to everything. So in terms of family, I grew up middle class in Ecuador, born and raised there. My father was an engineer, and I learned very quickly, what he did, and he built houses. And so he's responsible to making sure their house lasts at least 30 years. He built bridges. He's responsible that the bridge stands up after, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. So what do I do? How do I explain it to people? I study health systems, and I make sure try to contribute that the health system works and is a resilient health system, right? And so making sure that a health system is evidence-based and you have the best public health quickly and effectively, it makes a difference between catastrophe and containment. And for example, in Mexico in 2009, they shut down the economy, they shut down the airports, I remember, very early on. And, a disaster was avoided. And unfortunately, a lot of business people said, you've ruined us, and that was too early. And so now the leadership waited too long, just like they waited too long in many states here in the United States. And you've seen some of the modeling, right? The difference of 1 week could be 30 to 40,000 deaths in this country. So you have to act with the best science really quickly. And can it be avoided? Yes. And are we like an engineer with the health system? Not in this country, unfortunately. The health system is shambles, and it was not built to be prevention. It's built really, to be honest, to make money on treatment. So we had a terrible health system that was just not ready for what it was hit with. And so we have to do better, and we can do better. And there is plenty of examples out there in the world that we can do better. And I'm happy to work the next 10, 20, 30 years, hopefully, on trying to make sure that other countries, and this country, again, can withstand a pandemic and epidemic much better terms than we've done. Thank you.
Thank you, Drs. Delgado, Galarraga, and Hernandez. This was a phenomenal conversation. I feel very privileged to have been able to participate in it with you, and I'm giving you a round of applause, and I hope everybody at home is giving you a round of applause as well. This concludes our panel today. Thank you again, and for our participants, we look forward to seeing you at the next one.